Okay, my name's Craig Labovitz with Arbor Networks. Danny's not here. He said something about elk season. Full screen. Yeah, it's just the touchpad. There we go. Piece of cake. Okay, I'll try to keep this brief. Earlier this year, really the main motivation was SIGCOMM tutorial we were giving for researchers. Really tried to get some quantitative data on the nature, rate, size, scale of attacks that are occurring within the Tier 1, Tier 2 content provider community, both in North America and actually EMA throughout the world. Certainly there's no shortage of qualitative data. If you read any of the press trade magazines about DOS attacks and about zombies, even read the New Yorker recently. You know, zombies are everywhere. There's quite a bit of qualitative information. But it's clear once you actually start to read research papers and see other parts of the community really struggling with quantitative, the real numbers. And certainly, you know, vendors don't help the qualitative either. So earlier this year, we sent out a survey to about 50, 60 different providers. Of those providers, we got back some 42 responses. 32 or 36 multiple choice survey. I think some of those responses actually were interesting from a sociological point of view. Though it was a 32 multiple choice choose one, many of the surveys came back with multiple answers. And I don't know what it is about network providers, but quite a few also decided that A, B, C, D weren't sufficient. They created their own. So be that as it may, we had to disqualify a couple of the responses. And really we'll go into the background of the survey. So a cross-section of the Tier 1s, Tier 2s, most of the major U.S. providers we hit, as well as most of the major content providers. You know, a couple of large enterprises, content providers, and so on. And I'll come back to that slide I just passed over in a second. But one of the questions really surveyed are, what are the problems you're facing today? Is it compromised machines? Is it DNS attacks? Is it BGP attacks? Are there more exotic attacks you're seeing? And by far the biggest threat that folks talked about in their surveys was, you know, it's just brute force DDoS attacks continue to predominate the things that different providers are spending their time on, their dollars on, and the thing that they're responding to their customers on. Worms was also up there in the top single threat, but that was more to the degree that the worms acted as DDoS and impacted both customer as well as upstream bandwidth. Within the top threat, no one seemed very interested in BGP attacks, ASN attacks, other types of routing attacks. A couple of folks did mention that they have had their backbone routers compromised, and that both as well as their configuration, their OSS infrastructure was compromised. That was one of their top threats, but the majority really were DDoS. When you look at the top two largest threats, things don't change too much, with the exception of BGP did make it in amongst the top set of two largest threats. And this slide just reiterates those points. You know, despite 5-6 years after DDoS getting the headlines, it continues to be, fairly prosaic, the largest single concern by providers. BGP vulnerabilities weren't up there. And, you know, from a research perspective, all this may or may not be surprising if you read a lot of research papers and where both the research and perhaps the vendor community are spending their efforts. There's a little bit of a disconnect between what providers are actually seeing and the more exotic different attack modalities that a lot of the research arena is focused on. So when we actually asked what was the largest attack, for the largest attack you've seen in the last 6 months, for the largest attack you've seen in the last year, as well as what for all the majority of the customer impacting attacks you see, what are they? Are they exotic, you know, massive zombie armies simulating HTTP, SQL queries? It turns out that, you know, close to well over 90% of the attacks were brute force TCP, SYN, UDP attacks. Not very exotic. There were some discussion of more exotic attacks, but by and large, providers are mostly seeing just brute force attacks. And I think when we enter in dialogue with providers, it's for an obvious reason. They work. While there are more exotic attacks out there, it turns out that, you know, whether you have a bot army or you just have some number of, you know, spoofing, TCP, SYN, and UDP continue to be very effective today for large numbers of end systems, as well as, you know, bottleneck bandwidth, bottleneck links. Trying to get a sense of the scale and the rate of attacks when we look across all providers, the average was, again, we didn't really normalize for the size of provider, or we didn't have enough information to do normalize per customer towards other sorts of metrics. But purely looking at the average across the survey respondents, they were seeing about 40 customer impacting attacks a month. Those were typically attacks where a ticket was opened and some type of action, either wait till the attack ended or it made it into the knock. A couple of providers described much more in terms of the hundreds of attacks, and this tended to be the residential, the broadband sorts of providers. We also asked about infrastructure impacting attacks, where it actually began not the customer, but actually either was so large that it was impacting upstream or backbone bandwidth, or attacks actually targeting the infrastructure itself. And infrastructure is not quite as popular as end systems and end customers, averaging about 1 to 2 a month. Some providers noted here did see much more, but the majority were really fewer than 10. In terms of bandwidth, the survey included how large are the attacks. And though there were attacks reported, a number of survey response reported attacks in the 10 gigabit or above range, the vast majority of attacks were in the 1 to 10 gigabit range, where I think about 4 gigabits seemed to be about average for the largest attacks people had observed in the last 6 months. It was also interesting that there wasn't much of a difference between the responses for the last 6 months, last year were basically the same, which either means that it's perhaps indicative of a worsening problem or a plateauing problem. We asked providers what were they using to do detection. Quite a few, the majority, indicated, or 20%, indicated they had commercial tools. Customer calls were big. This was typically for the transit providers and open source and in-house tools. I also found this a little bit interesting, though not surprising. The single largest way that folks mitigate attacks today is via BGP, typically destination-based BGP, but also increasingly URPF-based. And this is primarily because the tools don't exist. Actually managing more than a dozen attacks, managing the ACLs, whether you trust the cards, the router configuration, or just managing the ACLs, is incredibly unwieldy. So being able to actually announce BGP off-ramps from a single bastion router, from a single control router, was much more appealing and much more scalable. There was, smattering of the response did have other commercial mitigation, whether it be firewalls or other sorts of intelligent filtering applied. But the majority of the ways that ISPs today, at least in the survey, mitigate attacks is by completing it, by actually filtering out the destination or the /24 from the net. There's quite a bit of, for lack of a better word, FUD when you talk about zombie armies and the size of zombie armies growing. Certainly a number of recent press articles about the incredible growth and the threat faced by zombies. And, it was, I think, interesting in the survey as well that folks talked about these massive zombies that they had seen, the 10,000, 100,000. And when we asked a couple of them, how did they measure this? The answer we got back was, well, they didn't. It just seemed that large. So it is kind of interesting. I think there's a lot of discussion about zombies, but it tends to be very difficult actually to validate or to measure the size of attacks. In fact, with everyone we checked with who did describe very large zombie nets, they really didn't have any quantitative results. It was just qualitative. But I think the take-home point of the majority of the survey response really indicate that they hadn't seen a growth in the size of the zombie armies, though several respondents did mention that they had seen a change in tactics. It was much more sophisticated. They described reinforcements, and it felt like reading, a war movie with armies and all sorts of different tactics. Some of the survey asked what was actually under attack. Many of the respondents didn't know that it was their customer infrastructure. They really didn't know what the actual end sites were, that the actual hosting sites were beyond that. But when folks did reply, it was kind of what you'd expect. A lot of it was IRC servers, gambling, porn, always up there in internet. And interestingly, that there are a few other things that were cited by more than one, which included, Chinese came up a couple of times, as well as the RIA. Just in the interest of, I'll spend just a quick second on this. A wide range of different security teams I think there was a lot of frustration with the survey respondents about the size of the team, the organization teams, both within Tier 1s and Tier 2s. Typically in the broadband, it was much more structure, much more actually dedicated resources, which always was not the case in the Tier 1, Tier 2s in the survey. A number of folks, when they asked about threats, what really scared them, kept them up at night. Despite all of the ACLs, despite all of the TAC acts, despite all the security, one European provider described how Tiger Team had actually managed to compromise his entire OSS infrastructure simply by calling the knock and through social engineering. So despite all the structural safeguards, social engineering always will be out there. Finally, to wrap up, that some of the survey actually asked about once an attack's identified, what's the response? And law enforcement, actually the number of attacks that were actually referred to law enforcement was a fairly small minority, really under 1.5% of all the customer impacting attacks actually were referred to law enforcement. When asked why so few, the responses ranged from jurisdictional issues. You're a European provider and you're dealing with a U.S.-based attack or attack originating in the U.S. What's the jurisdictional involved? A number of respondents talked about calling local FBI offices and saying, I'm under attack, and the attack, the actual crime they had to justify the attack actually cost so much money in a given jurisdiction before law enforcement would be engaged. Gambling is technically, or online gambling, especially offshore, is technically illegal in the U.S., so it's a little bit tricky to actually call up law enforcement and ask for their assistance, and so on. And also, quite frankly, the tools involved and the lack of forensics. So finally, just to wrap up, DDoS continues to be the biggest threat. Mitigation detection techniques are one of the largest impediments, both to mitigation law enforcement. And tools and staffing were a major factor in how different providers handle the attacks across the survey. I think Danny and I plan to try conducting the survey again, perhaps on a slightly larger scale. And we appreciate everyone who participated in the survey. The full results are available on the web. And I think in the future we've learned a lesson about ambiguous multiple choice questions, or actually we'll automate it this time and not leave so much room for provider creativity. With that said, I think we have a minute for questions.
We can take a few.
Hi, Randy.
Randy Bush, IJ. Any guess, figures, measurement of how much, what proportion of DDoS is IP address spoofed?
We talked to a number of folks about trying to estimate that, and as a vendor, we've got some measures, but nothing that came from this survey. Folks had different claims, but the sense I got was very few folks actually had the ability to measure it or to quantify it, at least in any meaningful way.
Is it significant?
I don't have good numbers. Anything else?
Quick question. Jerry Dixon, Homeland Security, U.S. CERT. One of the things on the law enforcement side that we've been coming across is people refusing to be listed as victims. Just recently with Zotab, certain media companies were telling the world on the news, but were refusing to file an actual complaint, which basically hinders law enforcement from doing their job. So essentially it took 36 hours from time that it was reported to actually get somebody to file that they were being a victim. And I just wanted to highlight that it's not always the capabilities of the law enforcement entity, but it's also the facts of people actually wanting to file as a victim, even though they're telling the world they actually don't want to file that specific complaint.
Yeah, absolutely. The survey was really for the providers, and it was really provider reasons why they didn't pursue. But absolutely, certainly there's incentive for customers.
Nick Feemster, Georgia Tech. Same question as Randy's, but for hijacked prefixes. Do you get a sense for how many of these attacks come from that kind of space?
Yeah, I think actually there's a talk at this NANOG about hijacked prefixes. Is that no? Maybe just yeah. I think it's I don't have good numbers on that. I think it's an interesting question. It's somewhat difficult to measure. I think there's been a number of research efforts to correlate hijacked prefixes both with DOS logs as well as hijacked prefixes with, multi-gigabyte, spam logs. And I think that the results have been mixed. My sense of it is that when I tried to do work in this area, it was now 2 or 3 years ago, that despite, the publicity it got, there really wasn't much I could actually correlate looking through gigs and gigs, and maybe there was one. There's certainly, validated reports now of at least, 3 or 4 cases where there actually have been hijacked prefixes, but I think the short answer is, my sense, I don't have good numbers, is that it's just, that's more effort. There's just no need for it.
Thanks.
Last question? No? Oh, well, you're actually moderating, so I'll let you. I mean, I don't want to make the decision
Let's
about
keep
lunch.
going. Yeah, right. Okay, just keep going. We'll see what happens.
I'm getting hungry. Okay.
We're actually pretty much right on time.
All right,
so.
Mehmet,
Okay.
again from University of Puerto Rico. I actually am very interested in the research that you have done because I was for 4 years running an IRC server together with European Nuclear Research Center, where they were making big researches about denial of service attacks. And I have noticed that during this time, most of the time when we tried to solve the situations with law enforcement, it was pretty hard. However, when we go directly to ISPs, who we know the computers are hacked and computers are hijacked, it seemed to be better to get those solved. And most computers that we noticed, they were basically home users with DSL or cable internet access, high-speed internet access. So do you think that against denial of service attacks, ISPs should take a responsibility of the users that they have in their backbones and then keep the security, or should law enforcement go to the user instead of going to the ISPs?
So I'm not sure I can answer that question fairly. I tend to be a security vendor, so my responsibility is all vendors should take responsibility.
Like, for example, let me give an example. At the moment, I think American Online, not that I'm using it so often, but they have like a firewall and a spam scanner for your... Do you think that all ISPs should provide some kind of software for their clients so that they can secure their computers?
Sure. Sounds good to me. So I think two real, rather than that facetious response, I think two real responses. One is, you're certainly seeing this within the I2 community. There's a lot of now enforced sort of before you can actually attach to most of the I2 institutions. You do actually have to validate, before you can down the VPN that you actually do have the viral software installed. I think secondly, what seems to be happening in the marketplace is that, I don't think there's really the market incentive for provider to force thousands of their end systems, whether you be in the broadband or subscriber edge. I think you do see the opposite commercial pressure, which is for tier 1s and tier 2s to essentially provide clean pipes to large hosting customers. I think it's following the economics, and I don't think there's economics now for large cable provider in the U.S. to enforce this on all of their users. In fact, I think there's the opposite pressure.
Thanks.
Okay, and last question.
Very quick one, Matt Pitak from Yahoo. I think there may be a little bit of a sort of a chicken and the egg phenomena happening for part of the survey, in that you note 90% of the attacks are still TCP, SYN, UDP, flood, the brute force attacks. This is based on a survey rather than an actual empirical observation of networks. It may simply be that we're all still too overworked and don't have really good tools at our disposal to spot anything other than, oh my God, the pipes are full. So in asking a survey like this, you may actually be getting just a biased response of what are the things that you can spot, not what kind of attacks are really happening.
Yeah. So I think the short answer to that is I don't think so. Actually, I'm no longer quite a researcher, but I do, from a commercial perspective, have access to, a fairly significant set of security-related events and database. And I can tell you from a commercial perspective, the survey does match what we see commercially across both EMA and North America.
Would you like to, add in your next one, you talked about doing a future one, possibly correlate your observational with the survey?
Yeah, I'm not allowed to use all, so the commercial data is hard to use.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Craig.